All right, so the big highlight here, Antiochus Epiphanes. And again, this is from Daniel 11:21 to 32, is all about Antiochus Epiphanes.
In his place shall rise a contemptible person, on whom royal majesty had not been conferred. He shall come in without warning, and obtain the kingdom through intrigue. End quote. This verse is describing King Antiochus IV of the Seleucid Empire. You can immediately see that Antiochus IV is the villain of our story, as according to the text, he is a contemptible person. And what I really want to draw your attention to is that he is someone on whom royal majesty had not been conferred. This means that Antiochus was not in the royal succession, and therefore was never expected to become king. And this makes sense when we remember that Antiochus III had two sons. Seleucus IV was the eldest, and Antiochus IV the youngest. Being the eldest, Seleucus IV succeeds his father. Then Seleucus IV has children of his own, to whom the crown should have gone to. There is absolutely no reason why we should have expected Antiochus IV to become king. Nevertheless, the verse reads, he will come in without warning and obtain the kingdom through intrigue. And when we analyze the historical record, this is precisely what happens. Only through intrigue is Antiochus able to take the throne. As a result of the Treaty of Apamea, Antiochus III is forced to send his youngest son, Antiochus IV, to be a prisoner in Rome. Following on from this, Appian continues to write, quote, afterward, on the death of Antiochus the Great, his son Seleucus succeeded him. So Seleucus IV is now king, and his brother Antiochus is in prison in Rome. Seleucus IV also has two sons of his own. The eldest is Demetrius, and the youngest Antiochus. Now, after Seleucus IV becomes king, Appian writes, quote, he, Seleucus IV, gave his son Demetrius as a hostage in place of his brother Antiochus. End quote. Let's break this down slowly and bring up a map to help our understanding. So Antiochus IV is in prison in Rome, fulfilling the conditions of the Treaty of Apamea. When Seleucus IV becomes king, he decides he wants to free his brother from prison. So he sends his eldest son Demetrius to Rome, and Demetrius swaps position with Antiochus IV. So Antiochus is now free. Antiochus then starts to make his way back to the Seleucid Empire. Now, as previously discussed, before becoming the sole ruler of the Seleucid Empire, Antiochus IV first co-rules the empire with his young nephew, also named Antiochus, whom we also believes he adopts as his stepson. Now, Antiochus IV is not a good man, and he does not want to share power with his nephew, as Newsom writes in her commentary, quote, although Antiochus IV initially ruled as co-regent with his nephew and stepson, the boy was murdered 5 years later. Antiochus IV had no intention of being displaced by the boy or of sharing real power with him. Thus, he well deserves his designation as treacherous. End quote. Now, let's pause a moment and ask ourselves the question, what evidence do we have that Antiochus IV killed his nephew? Now, this period of Seleucid history is somewhat shrouded in mystery, but we do have two sources that suggest that Antiochus IV did kill his nephew in order to take full control of the empire. The first is a cuneiform tablet, which contains a king list, and the second is a Greek historian known as Diodorus. In the first portion of the tablet, it tells us that after Seleucus IV the king died, the same month Antiochus his son ascended the throne, and he reigned for 11 years. In the next part of the tablet, we're told that there's a period of time in which Antiochus IV and his adopted son share the crown, so we have a period of co-ruleship. Next, and very importantly, we're told that Antiochus IV actually kills his adopted son. And lastly, the tablet reads that in the year 143, Antiochus IV was sole king. Diodorus was a Greek historian who wrote between 60 and 30 BC. In one section of his writing, we read the following, quote, Andronicus, who assassinated the son of Seleucus, Antiochus, and who was in turn put to death, willingly lent himself to an impious and terrible crimes, only to share the same fate as his victim, end quote. Now, this quote is quite ambiguous, but we do know that Andronicus was a court officer of Antiochus IV, and what scholars believed is implied by this text is that Antiochus IV ordered Andronicus to kill the son of Seleucus, that is, Antiochus. But then Antiochus IV, to appear guiltless in the whole affair, executes Andronicus for the assassination. Therefore, the text reads that Andronicus was in turn put to death. Both Diodorus, our Greek historian, and the Babylonian king list provide convincing evidence that Antiochus IV really did kill his nephew in order to secure the sole rule over the Seleucid Empire.
So again, just to summarize verse 21 to 22 there. So we see here the vile Antiochus IV Epiphanes become the new king of the north. He was not in line to rule, but came in through intrigue, as the NRSV puts it, instead of flatteries. Now, I'm hoping it's clear that the exploits of Antiochus start in verse 21 and end in verse 32. Again, I hope it's very clear that everything prior was describing the previous Seleucid or Ptolemaic kings. And none of the exploits of verse 2 to 32 should be attributed to Antichrist. Everything so far you can attribute to the Seleucid or Ptolemaic kings or Antiochus. So again, I just want to make that clear because some Bible teachers will teach that some of these verses refer to Antichrist. And again, there's really no evidence for that. With that said, though, you'll soon see that all the exploits from verse 36 onwards should be attributed to Antichrist and none of those to Antiochus. And we'll see that shortly. So again, just to summarize, 2 to 20, previous Seleucid and Ptolemaic kings. 21 to 32, that's all Antiochus Epiphanes. 33 to 35, that's our central axis, God's people throughout time. And then 36 to 45 is all the end times Antichrist.
Verse 22, it says that armies shall be utterly swept away and broken before him. About this, Newsom writes in her commentary, quote, although the reference in verse 22 to armed forces being swept away suggests military action, there is no other evidence to suggest that Antiochus fought his way to the kingship. It may rather be that this phrase is a general characterization of his kingship as a whole, and the Prince of the Covenant as well. Now, it's widely accepted that the Prince of the Covenant is referring to the high priest at the time, a man by the name of Antiochus III. So, in his commentary, writes, quote, among those who fell victim to him was one called the Prince of the Covenant, probably an allusion to the high priest Onias III, who apparently had pro-Ptolemaic sympathies, see 2 Maccabees 4, 1-6. Jason, a brother of Onias, backed by the rich and powerful pro-Seleucid Tobiad family, was able to bribe the king for the position of high priest, see 2 Maccabees 4, 7-10. So let's pause here a moment. So we have Jason, who is a brother of Onias III, and he bribes the king for the position of the high priest. Therefore, Jason gives Antiochus money, and in return, Antiochus bestows the high priesthood upon Jason. We continue to read in so, Antiochus agreed to the deal, but only until a better one came along, in this case from Menelaus, who would later offer a higher bid for the office. End quote. So now we have another man, Menelaus, who, just like Jason, bribes Antiochus IV, but now with even more money, and in return Antiochus IV takes the high priesthood off Jason and gives it to Menelaus. Verse 23, which says, after an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully and become strong with a small party. About this verse, so writes the following. Verse 23 probably alludes to the deal with Jason, but surely not to that alone. The Hebrew word for alliance in 1123 is an abstract noun. It may refer not to any particular event, but to various means of connection. The point is that Antiochus is able to use such means, the Hebrew says literally, from connection, to advance his purposes through deceit. Thus, this verse calls attention to shady deals such as the one he made with Jason, but also to deals that he forged with Eumenes of Pergamum, with Menelaus, with various political allies and would-be enemies. Bluntly put, Antiochus was a wheeler-dealer who came to power from disadvantageous positions and with limited resources. End quote. Therefore, when verse 23 says that Antiochus became strong with a small party, this could really refer to any of these connections, and most likely to other alliances we're not aware of. Verse 24, and is actually quite a difficult verse. So let's break it down into its two parts. The first part talks about that without warning he should come to the richest parts of the province and do what none of his predecessors had ever done, lavishing plunder, spoil, and wealth on them. Now, it's not particularly clear what the word province here is referring to. As Xiao writes in his commentary, verse 24 is obscure as the NRSV renders it, for the text is unclear as to what the richest part of the province might refer to. End quote. But what is clear from verse 24 is that Antiochus IV was known for his generous gifts. As Newsom writes in her commentary, while extravagant spending and lavish gift-giving were ways in which ancient monarchs demonstrated their power and secured gratitude from their followers, Antiochus IV impressed ancient writers as being excessive even by their standards. See Polybius, Livy, and Josephus. The next part of the verse talks about, he shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. Again, we can't be too certain as to what this is referring to. Xiao writes in his commentary that it might be referring to the construction of the Acra. We have not yet begun talking about the Acra, as this occurs in the second invasion of Judea, which we have not spoken about yet. But it was a fortress that was built near the Temple Mount that many of the Jews found very offensive. So it might be referring to that. Or what I think it's referring to is simply his invasion of Egypt. So Xiao also notes, yet one may also take the reference to anticipate Daniel 11:25-28, which concerns his invasion of Egypt.
All right, so just to summarize there, 23 to 24, 22 to 24, I should say. The arms here, the arms of a flood, could also be referenced to his allegiance with Eumenes of Pergamon. If you remember from our Revelation 2 study, Pergamon is where Satan dwells. And so here, and that's kind of later on, but right now what it's saying is that Antiochus IV makes an alliance with Eumenes of Pergamon. Now, verse 23 there, he works deceitfully by making deals and becomes strong with a few amount of people. That should say of. Now, although these words do not speak specifically of Antichrist, so just like we talked about, everything here from 21 to 32 is all about Antiochus, but they can actually be seen as a type for Antichrist. So it's a type and shadow of Antichrist to come. So, you know, Satan is behind the scenes making deals. You know, you have big groups like the Bilderberg Group or things like that, you know, some people refer to the Illuminati, but generally just these deals that are made, these people at the top, you know, and so it doesn't take Satan a lot of people to be in on conspiracy. It just takes a handful of people at the very, very top. Not everyone kind of below them has to be in on it. Now, verse 24 is another type and shadow for Antichrist, who, again, Satan lavishing great gifts on those that follow him. So you guys have heard of, you know, some of these celebrities who sell their souls to the devil, basically getting these, you know, really nice deals, but, you know, they basically forsake God and proclaim to follow Satan. We can get into that in a different video, but generally these things do happen. Now, I didn't include it for time's sake, but in the original video, the author actually went into great detail on Antiochus IV's extreme gift-giving and lavishing riches on those around him, much more than his ancestors had ever done. And that's kind of that phrase there, so that which his fathers have not done. And he would give like buildings, he would dedicate museums, he was just really extreme with the gift-giving and lavishing riches on people. Now, Daniel 25-26, I'll just read this part out here. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. So verse 25 there is referring to Antiochus, and he raises a large army to go south. At this time, the Seleucids are in control of Jerusalem. And Ptolemy VI is lead co-regent. So in the Ptolemy kingdom, Egypt, basically there's three co-rulers. The older brother Ptolemy, his sister Cleopatra II, daughter of Cleopatra I, obviously, and Ptolemy VIII. And so these three are ruling together, but Ptolemy is kind of the lead position of the three. And he too raises a large army. However, those that are close to him, so Ptolemy is quite young, and those that are close to him plot his demise. And that's what it means there. They shall forecast devices against him. Now, Ptolemy VI is young and inexperienced in war, and his closest advisors purposely give him bad advice, leading to military losses and his army being scattered. Many die. And that's what verse 26 is referring to. They that are close to him, that feed the portion of his meat, shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, meaning be scattered, and many of his army shall fall down slain. Now, verses 27 to 28. And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Then shall he return to his own land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. So Antiochus defeats Ptolemy VI, and they meet at the negotiating table. Now, note that Antiochus here has only conquered part of Egypt. He actually wants all of it. Now, also recall that Antiochus is actually Ptolemy VI's uncle. So remember, Antiochus has a sister, Cleopatra I, who is the mother of Ptolemy VI, Cleopatra II, and Ptolemy VIII. So Antiochus is their uncle. And he makes promises. He promises to make Ptolemy VI the sole regent of Egypt. So instead of being a co-rulership, he says, I can help it so you become ruler of all of Egypt, in exchange for helping to take all of Egypt, which is a lie. And so that's what they mean. Let's go conquer Alexandria so I can restore you as the king of Egypt. So that was Antiochus's lie. Now, Ptolemy's lie was saying he trusts Antiochus and agrees to the plan. Again, he was just biding time. So he says he trusts Antiochus and he has no intention of going back to his brother and sister. So again, that's also a lie. Now, verse 28, satisfied with the apparent plan, Antiochus returns back to his own land, Babylon. But on the way back, he raids the temple of Jerusalem for much of the silver and gold. And we can read this in 1 Maccabees 20 to 24. All right, so let's just carry on here. Verses 29 to 30.
Well, in verse 29, we read the following. At the appointed time, he, Antiochus, shall return and come into the south, but this time it shall not be as it was before. End quote. So Antiochus is going to attack Egypt again. So let's discuss the events that lead up to this second invasion of Egypt. A very nice description of this time period is found in Livy, book 45, which reads, quote, Antiochus was now master of the rest of Egypt, but after his check before Alexandria, he retired from its walls. The elder Ptolemy VI, whose restoration to his throne Antiochus pretended was his sole object in invading Egypt, was left at Memphis, and Antiochus withdrew his army in Syria, prepared to attack whichever brother should prove victorious. End quote. Before continuing, can I just quickly draw your attention to the phrase Antiochus pretended his sole object was the restoration of Ptolemy VI to the throne? This makes perfect sense of the phrase in verse 27 that they exchanged lies. So yet again, Daniel 11 hitting the nail on the head. Okay, let's continue to read Livy. Quote, Ptolemy was quite aware of Antiochus's intention. What made Ptolemy VI suspicious of Antiochus was after handing over the rest of Egypt, he had left a strong garrison in Pelusium. It was obvious that Antiochus was holding the key of Egypt in order to make a fresh invasion whenever he chose, and for Ptolemy to engage in the intestine strife with his brother would prove to be to his ruin, since even if victorious, he would be no match for Antiochus after an exhausting war. So what is he going to do? Well, he realizes he needs to win back the trust of his brother and sister and be readmitted back into the co-kingship and be allowed to return to Alexandria. So Ptolemy begins sending messages to his sister asking to be reinstated as king and asking her to convince their brother to let him back into Alexandria. So Antiochus is returning for his second invasion of Egypt, as verse 29 tells us, quote, At the time appointed, he, Antiochus, shall return and come into the south, but this time it shall not be as it was before, end quote. So verse 29 here is contrasting Antiochus' successful first Egyptian campaign with what will be a disastrous second invasion. Siao in his commentary writes the following, quote, Antiochus again invaded Egypt, although it would not be as before. Antiochus scored initial victories, but as he was preparing to attack Alexandria again, a Roman fleet suddenly showed up, end quote. So the reason why this second invasion into Egypt is not successful is because the Romans intervened to protect Egypt. We read this in verse 30, quote, For the ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall lose heart and withdraw, end quote. This word here, Kittim, is referring to the Romans. Our historical sources tell us that during this time period, the Roman Senate sends an official by the name of Pompilius down to Egypt to prevent war from breaking out between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Pompilius comes and warns Antiochus that if he attacks Alexandria, then Rome will declare war upon him. Antiochus is so terrified of the Romans, he agrees not to attack Egypt. And as you can imagine, this is absolutely humiliating for him. Now, while down in Egypt, a rumor spreads back in Jerusalem that Antiochus has been killed. Now, this is where it's important that we take another step back and remind ourselves what's going on in Jerusalem. At this time, Menelaus is high priest. But remember that during the reign of Antiochus IV, there were two previous high priests. The man who was first high priest was Onias III, and he was the legitimate high priest. But Onias' brother Jason bribes Antiochus for the high priesthood and promises to Hellenize Jerusalem, which means to make it more Greek and less Jewish. The book of Daniel will call Hellenization forsaking the covenant, which we'll see later on. So Antiochus takes the high priesthood off Onias and gives it to Jason. But then what happens is that the man Menelaus does the exact same thing that Jason does. He bribes Antiochus with even more money and promises to further Hellenize Jerusalem. So Antiochus takes the high priesthood off Jason and gives it to Menelaus. Now, in the eyes of a faithful Jewish person at the time, Menelaus is far worse than Jason, because at least Jason was the brother of the legitimate high priest Onias, so there was still some sort of continuity. In contrast, Menelaus had absolutely no right to be the high priest. Now, all of this information is very important to keep in the back of our minds, because as I said before, during this time period, everyone in Jerusalem thinks that Antiochus has died down in Egypt. So, Jason, thinking Antiochus is dead, tries to overthrow Menelaus. Siao writes in his commentary, quote, Meanwhile, rumors reached Palestine that Antiochus had been killed. Jason, who had been deposed as high priest by Antiochus in favor of Menelaus, led a group of rebels to storm Jerusalem, forcing Menelaus to retreat to the citadel to join the mercenaries. The timing of the rebellion could not have been worse, end quote. And the reason why the timing is so bad is because Antiochus is already angry about his defeat to the Romans, and now he has an insurrection on his hand. So he is furious. Siao writes in his commentary, quote, Already humiliated by the Romans, Antiochus unleashed the fullness of his anger upon the Jews. So Antiochus attacks Jerusalem. And this is our fourth and final event of the Sixth Syrian War, the second attack of Jerusalem in 168 BC. And during this attack, Jason is defeated. Having now reviewed all this history, let's now read verse 30 of Daniel chapter 11. It reads, For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall lose heart and withdraw. End quote. So this part of the verse is referring to Antiochus's second attack of Egypt in 168 and his humiliating encounter with Rome. The verse then continues, quote, He shall be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. He shall turn back and pay heed to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. End quote. Now, this section of the verse is referring to Antiochus's second attack upon Jerusalem in 168 after Jason tries to revolt. Now, the ending phrase in this verse, that Antiochus shall pay heed to those who forsake the Holy Covenant, on first glance is a little bit confusing. But what it means, as Siao writes, is that, quote, Antiochus supported those who forsake the Holy Covenant, that is, Jewish renegades like Menelaus, End quote. So remember, even though Jason isn't a good guy, he still has more of a claim to the high priesthood, being the brother of Onias, and therefore Menelaus is seen as the one who truly represents forsaking the covenant.
So just to summarize 29 to 30 there, as discussed, Antiochus' second campaign into Egypt does not go well. He is humiliated by the Romans. This is the famous line in the sand story. And basically, in 168 BC, a Roman counselor, Pompilius, now you can see Pompilius didn't have much of an army behind him. It was just kind of him himself, kind of not clothed in any armor or anything, just an older guy. And here's Antiochus with his army, many soldiers getting ready to march into Alexandria, part of Egypt. And basically the senator comes up and says to him, he tells him he has to leave and he's not allowed to attack. Otherwise, it'll be a declaration of war. And Antiochus actually says, well, I'll think about it. And this is when Pompilius draws a line in the sand, around a circle in the sand, right around Antiochus. And he says to him that you have to provide an answer before you step out of the circle. Otherwise, if you step out of the circle before providing an answer, we'll consider that a declaration of war. So you can imagine this really humiliating situation for Antiochus in front of all his soldiers, just by this, armorless guy. And he has to withdraw. He can't fight the Romans, and so it's just embarrassing for him. And this is kind of a really bad timing situation for Jason to attack Menelaus, because Antiochus is already humiliated, and then now he's like just incensed when he finds out that it seems like the people in Jerusalem are revolting. So again, when he hears of a revolt in Jerusalem, Jason thought Antiochus was dead, and he tried to forcibly take back the high priesthood from Menelaus. He feels even more disrespected and takes out his rage on the Hebrews. So this is why he's so enraged at this point. Those who forsake the Holy Covenant are the Hellenizers, like Menelaus, who are trying to make the Hebrews more like the Greeks. If you read through Maccabees, you'll see that there's certain things that the Hellenizers were trying to do. They're trying to create like gyms and have wrestling and kind of just make the Jews very much like the Greeks. Now, verse 31, all these events happened during Antiochus' second excursion into Jerusalem, which we can read in 1 Maccabees 1, 29 to 64. So I just want to kind of go through 1 Maccabees a little bit there. So occupation of Jerusalem. And this is to really get a good idea of what Antiochus was like. And if you can kind of see what Antiochus is like, you'll have a good idea how Antichrist is going to be like. Antiochus is specifically described, especially in the book of Maccabees, as a type of the Antichrist. So a lot of things that you'll see that Antiochus does, these same descriptions actually have been described of Antichrist, whether through Daniel, Revelation, even other books. But let's just talk about this 1 Maccabees 1. So 29. 2 years later, the king sent to the cities of Judah a chief collector of tribute, and he came to Jerusalem with a large force. Deceitfully, he spoke peaceable words to them. So Antiochus is telling them, everything's fine, I'm heading back there, everything's all good. And they believed him. But he suddenly fell upon the city and dealt it a severe blow and destroyed many people of Israel. He plundered the city, burned it with fire, tore down its houses and surrounding walls. They took captive the women and children and seized the livestock. Then they fortified the city of David with a large, strong wall and strong towers, and it became their citadel. They stationed there a sinful nation, men who were renegades. These strengthened their position. They stored up arms and food, and collecting the spoils of Jerusalem, they stored them there and became a great menace. So again, Antiochus pretends to come in peace, but attacks the city suddenly and severely, killing many. He plunders, burns, destroys, and takes captives. He creates the Acra, which is a military fortress near the temple, which was a pollution of the temple. It should really have had no business there, and the Jews were quite offended by that. The Acra was used to monitor the temple, protect the Hellenizers, garrison soldiers, and store up arms, food, and spoils from Jerusalem. Verse 39 to 40, her sanctuary, Jerusalem, became desolate like a desert. So the word desolate there. Her feast were turned into mourning, her Sabbaths into a reproach, her honor into contempt. Her dishonor now grew as great as her glory. Her exaltation was turned into mourning. So the temple becomes desolate, empty. Her previous honor, glory, and exaltation were turned into contempt, dishonor, and mourning. Then the king, Antiochus, wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people and that all should give up their particular customs. All the nations accepted the command of the king. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals. So here we really see Antiochus as a type for Antichrist. He demands a single overarching rulership and a single religion. So again, these are shades of a one world government and one world religion. To defile the sanctuary and the holy ones, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice pigs and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. So he really went after the Jewish customs and laws. He made them all illegal. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. He added, and whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. So he wants to take away all true worship and reverence for the one true God. Anyone not obeying this command is to die. And again, you'll see kind of the parallel today as this institution of these Noahide laws, which are coming, and will condemn those who believe in Jesus, who is the one true God. Jesus is God in the flesh. And so you're going to see an Antichrist-like figure who is going to do the same things that Antiochus did. He's going to basically make it hard to believe in Jesus. He's going to make it illegal, basically. 51. In such words, he wrote to his whole kingdom. He appointed inspectors over all the people and commanded the towns of Judah to offer sacrifice, town by town. Many of the people, everyone who forsook the law, joined them. So many people joined them, and they did evil in the land. They drove Israel into hiding in every place of refuge they had. So the true believers, Israel, were hiding in every place of refuge in the land. So again, this is similar for people in the end times. People, these inspectors they talk about, these are people who will turn on their family, friends, and neighbors. This is what Jesus says when I come, sister will become against, family members will become against each other in a house. He comes to divide, right? And people will do these things to each other. And this is sort of what's going to happen kind of in the end time situation here. And again, true believers, spiritual Israel, will be forced to go into hiding in places of refuge. I do believe, again, that there will be places of refuge for true believers, places that God can protect them, oversee them. If anyone gets a chance, you can read up on Kevin Zadai. He talks about Project Goshen, will there be areas of protection for people. But I think the same situation that happened there in Jerusalem in Antiochus's day, I do believe that we're going to have a repeat coming up soon. Now, on the 15th day of Kislev, in the 144th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege, abomination of desolation is kind of the other wording, on the altar of burnt offering. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah and offered incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. The books of the law that they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant, or anyone who adhered to the law, was condemned to death by decree of the king. And again, this is a big reason I believe that at some point the Bible will be made illegal. Again, that's another discussion. So contrary to common teaching, the abomination that makes desolate, written as desolating sacrilege here in the NRSV, is not the sacrifice of swine on the altar of burnt offering. So I hear a lot of TV pastors kind of teach that the abomination of desolation was pigs being sacrificed on the altar of burnt offering. That doesn't make a lot of sense. That is a wrong teaching. Strong's number, H8251, abomination, shikuts. And basically they describe it as something disgusting, filthy, idolatrous, or an idol. And that's actually its more typical usage. So an idol, especially anything idolatrous, but mainly an idol. So again, the reference here is an idol, an idol. Another definition from Brown, Drivers, Briggs, Hebrew definitions, a detestable thing or idol. So it's very clear here that the word abomination means an idol that makes desolate. This is the second temple. So it existed, actually, I'll just read from the text here. So the second temple finished completion in 516 BC, and it stood until 70 AD when it was destroyed by the Romans. Now, inside the inner court was the altar of burnt offering, where priests would sacrifice a lamb twice daily as a form of atonement. So if you remember, the daily sacrifice was actually two sacrifices, a morning and an evening sacrifice. And so that would occur at the altar of burnt offering, or ultimately called the altar of sacrifice. And that's all in Numbers 28:3. Now, it was on top of this altar that Antiochus would erect his own altar. So he puts an altar on top of the altar. And so it's kind of written somewhere that a pagan altar was placed on top of the Hebrew altar. Now, if you'll read there, the text there, they erected, meaning they put up, they built a desolating sacrilege, an abomination of desolation on the altar of burnt offering, meaning it was on top. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah. So just taking that note also. So again, this is just all saying that they built altars. And so basically what the abomination of desolation is it's something they built on top of the altar. And the thing that they built on the top of the altar was actually a statue of the Greek god Zeus. So they built that on top of the altar. There was, again, written somewhere where the Hebrews could not do their sacrifices because of this altar. So it was in the way. Now, the idolatry is an abomination. So this idolatry is an abomination, and the inability to carry out their daily sacrifices is what makes Jerusalem desolate. So they were no longer able to do their daily sacrifices, and so Jerusalem became desolate. And we read about that as Antiochus was kind of attacking the city there and all the things that he did afterwards. Now, the suppression of Judaism. So this is from 2 Maccabees 6. So this is just another scripture from Maccabees. Not long after this, the king sent an Athenian senator to compel the Jews to forsake the laws of their ancestors and no longer to live by the laws of God. Also, to pollute the temple in Jerusalem and to call it the temple of Olympian Zeus. So again, they rededicated the temple to Zeus, and they no longer allowed the Hebrews their twice daily sacrifices. The temple became a place of debauchery, prostitution, and pagan sacrifices instead. So if you kind of read further into 2 Maccabees 6, it actually talks about this. People could neither keep the Sabbath nor observe the festivals of their ancestors, nor so much as confess themselves to be Jews. And again, just another end times type and shadow for you. I do believe to say that you're a Christian will be a very difficult thing to do in the years ahead. Now, just want to review a couple other sources that also speak of this abomination of desolation. So to confirm that it is a statue of Zeus, it's not a pig on the altar. So here's from Josephus, and Josephus was a famous Jewish historian. And this is from book 12, chapter 5 of the Antiquities of the Jews. And when the king had built an idol altar upon God's altar, he slew swine upon it, and so offered a sacrifice that neither according to the law nor the Jewish religious worship in that country. He also compelled them to forsake the worship which they paid their own God, and to adore those whom he took to be gods, and made them build temples and raise idol altars in every city and village, and offer swine upon them every day. It's not the swine that's the abomination of desolation, it's the altar. It's the building of this statue of Zeus on top of the altar of sacrifice. This comes from St. Jerome. This is about 400 AD, and this is his commentary on the book of Daniel. I'll start here. But those of the other viewpoint claim that the persons mentioned are those who were sent by Antiochus 2 years after he had plundered the temple. So if you remember, he has a first attack on Jerusalem. That's when he plundered the temple. And then later, he comes back the second time, and that's when he exerts his wrath on the people there. In order to exact tribute from the Jews and also to eliminate the worship of God, setting up an image of Jupiter Olympius in the temple at Jerusalem. So again, he's saying that they put this image of Zeus, Jupiter, inside the Jerusalem temple. And also statues of Antiochus himself. These are described as the abomination of desolation. Having been set up, where the burnt offering and continual sacrifice were taken away. So he sets up this and they take away the daily sacrifice. So again, just really stressing the point that the Abomination of Desolation is this statue of Zeus built on top of the altar of burnt offering. Now, verse 31 here, it's very important to understand what the Abomination of Desolation is, because it is a dual prophecy with a near and far fulfillment. So this is from Matthew 24. And this here is a dual prophecy with a near and far fulfillment. So we'll just kind of go over that in detail, why knowing what this Abomination of Desolation is. So verse 15, when ye therefore shall see the Abomination of Desolation, these are the words of Jesus, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in winter, neither on the Sabbath day. So this is actually the near fulfillment. So when Jesus is speaking to them, and we talked about this in our one Bible study there, I put a link there. Jesus' disciples had just asked Jesus 3 questions, one of which was, when would the temple be destroyed? And so Jesus responds to them, this is when the temple is going to be destroyed. And this is the near fulfillment of the Abomination of Desolation. So Jesus references the Abomination of Desolation, which he knew to be a false idol standing in the temple. So here he says it right here, by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. And again, that's the statue of Zeus standing in the temple. So Jesus knew exactly what the Abomination of Desolation was. Now, the near fulfillment, the corresponding passage in Mark 13:14 also uses the term Abomination of Desolation. So in Mark 13:14, so just similar to Matthew, it says, but when ye shall see the Abomination of Desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand. Then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains. So that's Mark's version of it. Now, Luke actually says something different. Luke says, and when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, when you see Jerusalem surrounded with the Roman armies, and this is 70 AD, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. So what he's saying is that these armies are a symbol, a sign, an idol, desolation, of desolation. So it's kind of, he replaces the word there, abomination, with Jerusalem being compassed by armies. Now, the Roman armies were known to carry these standards. And so when Jerusalem is surrounded by these armies, they would be carrying these standards. And so these were these big poles with things on the top, various symbols, most common being these eagles. So the Aquila, eagle, was generally depicted holding Zeus's lightning bolt in its claws. So the eagle is a representation of Zeus. That picture I showed you, that statue, there's an eagle beside it. And again, the eagle, the Aquila, is a symbol of Zeus. It's actually a symbol of Rome as well. And a graven image of the Aquila was carried by the Roman legions into battle. So they couldn't carry a statue of Zeus into battle, but they can certainly carry these statues of eagles, which represent Zeus. And so typically you would see these Roman armies and they'd have these standards with eagles on top of them. Now, the whole notion of abomination revolves around idolatry. The Roman armies were very idolatrous, carrying their Roman standards, typically an eagle representing Zeus, into battle. So here's an excerpt from a site, revelationrevolution.org, and I'll just read it out here. Again, these are just more of the standards that they would carry into battle. So this is the near fulfillment of the abomination that causes desolation. During the Jewish war, Rome laid waste to Israel and worshipped the ensign called the Aquila, an idol of Zeus in Rome, on the eastern gate of the temple. During the Jewish war with Rome, in the middle of the 1st century AD, 70 AD, the idol of Zeus was the Aquila, the chief ensign of the Roman army. Aquila is an eagle who carried Zeus's lightning bolt and served as Zeus's messenger. The ensigns were more than military flags or standards signifying Rome and its many legions. The ensigns were idols in the most literal sense of the word, as they were regularly worshipped by the soldiers of the Roman army. So they would actually worship these idols. In fact, the Roman army worshipped and offered sacrifices to the ensigns on the eastern gate of the temple in AD 70. So Rome was surrounding Jerusalem with these idols, and they were sacrificing to them. So again, that is an abomination of desolation. And that's what Luke replaced with when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. You know, the other two, Matthew and Mark, they just talked about the abomination. So the abomination is the Roman armies with their standards, with their eagle idols. Thus, the ensign called the Aquila is in a sense an idol of Zeus himself, while doubling as the national symbol of Rome. And eagle also happens to be the symbol of the United States. And again, there's a connection there. We talked about Mystery Babylon in Revelation. Basically, Rome has gone into the United Nations, has affected all those nations there. This United Nations basically is Rome, the end times empire of Rome. It's not the final version of it. There's going to be another one, but that's where Rome is today. So that's the end times version of Rome, basically, is this one world government. The UN is sort of a precursor to that. We're going to see the UN at some point change into something else. Because the ensigns were graven images, idols, and foreign gods, it is not surprising that they were considered an abomination in first century Judea. The abominable nature of the Roman ensigns is exemplified in the Antiquities of the Jews. In this important historical work, Josephus tells us that in AD 37, the Jews begged the governor of Syria not to pass through Judea with the Roman legions because it was a violation of the law of Moses for Jews to be in the presence of the Roman ensigns. Similarly, when Pilate snuck the ensigns into Jerusalem at night, he was greeted with an angry crowd of Jews who petitioned him to remove the ensigns from Jerusalem. Pilate acquiesced when he saw that the Jews were willing to die rather than accept the presence of these idols in Jerusalem. So this is how strongly they felt about these idols. They did not like these. They considered them idols. And again, the eagle does represent Zeus, which was standing in the temple. Now, this is all to do with the near fulfillment of the prophecy, but there's actually also a far fulfillment of the abomination of desolation. So this is the far fulfillment, and we'll read about it in Revelation chapter 13. And I beheld another beast coming out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. So this is the false prophet. And he exercises all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. And he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast, an idol or some representation of the beast, which had the wound by a sword and did live. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast. So the false prophet can bring life to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak. So again, this can be an idol that speaks, and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Again, we talk about this in our Bible study, Revelation 13. I do believe that, there are plans to resurrect Nimrod, Gilgamesh. Again, that's all in that study. But just be prepared, whatever form this abomination takes, whether it's an AI, supercomputer, hologram, demon, alien, Nephilim, resurrected Gilgamesh clone, combination of these, whatever form this beast takes, it's going to have these features associated with it. And so just be wise, be careful what to watch for. Again, the abomination of desolation showed up in Antiochus' time, and it will show up again at the end times. Who knows what form it's going to take? It's going to take some, one of these types of forms. But this is what the Bible says. So again, just be prepared. All right, carrying on here, verse 32. So Antiochus will be on the side of the Hellenizers, those that corrupt the covenant. But there's a group of people, the Maccabees, that know their God and will oppose him. Now, you can read about all their exploits in the first and second book of Maccabees. There's a link there. Basically, the Maccabees rebel against Antiochus. They eventually take back Jerusalem. They actually end up restoring the temple. That's just all to be read there. So they do eventually do these things. And it's just the fact that they know their God leads us into the central axis of Daniel 10 to 12. So they describe the Maccabees as knowing their God. And that's really important because that's going to actually lead us into our central axis, verse 33 to 35. So they start off with these people that know their God. And then they're going to talk about in our central axis, the exploits of the saints, the other people that also know their God. So The Maccabees kind of start off this kind of people knowing their God, and we're going to read more about these people that know their God throughout time.